Putin does have a steely gaze. I mean, you really cannot read behind that. And it does make Trump nervous. He's willing to negotiate, but he also is not willing to be humiliated.
Well, you've got Donald Trump here. If he says that it's okay to grab Panama, for example, then why is it not okay for Vladimir Putin to grab Ukraine and for Xi Jinping to grab Taiwan? I think that he's comparing himself to them and trying to say, anything you can do, I can do bigger and better.
It's like World War I. Anything, any gunshot somewhere that we don't even think about can turn into something very dangerous. And because America is no longer a leader in this and sort of trying to provide some sort of checks and balances, it's free for all. It's almost like Trump is declaring free for all.
Where do you think the most likely global flashpoint will be in the coming years? Welcome to the Fourcast. Now, there are so many things that President Donald Trump said in the course of his inauguration that stand out. But one that really stood out for me that I want to discuss now is when he talked about expanding American territory. Now, what did he mean by that? Was he talking about a kind of 19th century style land grab? Was he talking about more American foreign policy muscle? What's going on here? Because a lot of people around the world, world leaders, strong men and not so strong men and women are scratching their heads thinking, what is America under Donald Trump, the sequel, going to be up to? So this matters to all of us. No one better to discuss this with than Nina Khrushcheva, Professor Nina Khrushcheva. She's not only the great-granddaughter of Khrushchev, the former Soviet leader, but also she is a professor of international relations at the New School in New York City. And of course, our very own international editor, Lindsey Hilsum. Welcome to you both. Nina, let me start off with you. When America now calls, or Donald Trump calls for expanding America, expanding American territory, what do you think he's actually talking about?
I'm not sure that they really meant it in terms of this traditional land purchasing, taking over. But we also noticed that Trump did not discard potential for armed conflict or armed taking over. I actually am not excluding anything with Trump right now. If he thinks it's convenient, they will go with force. Although I would imagine that his personal belief is that America can buy anything. I mean, that golden age of America with gold is coming up, and that's what I think we should expect more.
And also it's worth pointing out that his power seems to be pretty unfettered in the US at the moment. And certainly that's the way he thinks of it, because, the Supreme Court is in his corner. He's got a majority on Capitol Hill, and he thinks that he was elected with a landslide, even if that wasn't the case. So that's his mindset. Lindsey, same question to you. When he talked about expanding America in his speech, what do you think he meant?
I think he meant that he has a concept of America. It's like this sort of buccaneering 19th century imperial power. And it's a very masculine thing. It's like, here we are. I mean, you look at Xi Jinping over there and you look at Vladimir Putin over there. Well, you've got Donald Trump here. And I also can increase the territory over which I rule. And so I think if you look at the map, you see, yes, what's he talked about grabbing? He's talked about Canada. Well, the Canadians aren't too happy about that. He's talked about the Panama Canal. The Panamanians aren't too happy about that. He's talked about Greenland. Well, the Greenlanders and the Danes, who are actually control, and Greenland is part of Denmark now, aren't too happy about that. But then if you colour in the map, it's a sphere of influence, and it's a sphere of influence really which America had until really the last century. I mean, remember in the 20th century, the Americans were always fomenting coups all over Latin America. And now China is increasingly important in Latin America. It doesn't control the Panama Canal, as he said, but it does have a port at either end. And it has built a deep sea port off the coast of Peru as well. And it does buy most of the soybeans from Brazil and Argentina. So it is important. You see a lot more Chinese people than you used to in Latin America. So I think that he's carving out this sphere of influence. But the issue is, if he says that it's okay to grab Panama, for example, then why is it not okay for Vladimir Putin to grab Ukraine, or after Ukraine, maybe the Baltic states, and for Xi Jinping to grab Taiwan? And already we see, there's massive increase in the Chinese Navy and all of these exercises and maneuvers around the South China Sea, I think that he's comparing himself to them and trying to say, anything you can do, I can do bigger and better.
Remember when Putin was talking about spheres of influence at the beginning of Ukraine invasion, the American president, then Joe Biden, said, well, we don't deal in spheres of influence, which is, of course, ridiculous because America is the sphere of influence around the world. So Putin actually considered it very hypocritical. But now he finally, in fact, Russian spokeswoman for the Ministry of Foreign Affairs said, well, finally, America changed its set of values, like yippee. So that's all wonderful because we're all going to be strong men together. I don't think he forgot. I mean, Trump is not as stupid as people often portray him. He's quite a smart man, a very intuitive man for sure. But also if we talk about the gunfighter nation, sort of this frontier mentality, it's the Mexico we're dealing with. Because that's what John Wayne, not that Trump, maybe now he caught up with the Westerns, because all American presidents ultimately is performing one Western or another, even if they don't think it's their favorite genre in the movies. But that's the Mexico part, because that's what he thinks that's his electors were most interested in, because they are the ones who watch John Wayne. They are the ones who deal with Rio Grande and all these other things. And that's another part that I thought was fascinating, because suddenly thing that we believe is just decoration of American frontier mentality, the Western movie, is almost becoming reality again. And I think that's why the Panama Canal, the Latin America, and of course the Gulf of Mexico is an American Gulf. I mean, forget Mexico is almost not on the map anymore.
Lindsey, I mean, when you look at spheres of influence, you could argue, if you were slightly cynical, that actually what Trump is really trying to do here is just formalize a relationship, that has been kind of, there off and on for the last century or so. And it's really based on kind of geographical spheres of influence. But then you talk to the South Koreans and the Japanese on the other side of the Pacific Ocean to California, and they say, hang on a minute, geography doesn't make any sense for us. We want to be, protected by America. They're protecting our values and our democracy. We're in the wrong neighborhood. So how does that work?
Well, you remember Joe Biden, I was about to say poor old Joe Biden, which tells you something, doesn't it? But, he had this idea of an association of democracies, and that would be the connection across the world. And that's why, countries like South Korea and Japan, which of course have had American protection, since the Second World War and then since the Korean War, would have. And that was the kind of world he envisaged. And I don't think that Trump envisages that in any way. He really doesn't care what kind of system of government anybody has. And I think that the sphere of influence around the Americas is very different in his mind from in Joe Biden's mind, for example. I mean, who was there at the inauguration? Milei of Argentina. Milei, who is, he's a revolutionary, but he's not Che Guevara in the beret. He's a right-wing revolutionary like Trump, like Bolsonaro, one of those who believes in, in his own personal power. And I think that the other thing which is really important is how autocratic Trump comes across. Now, to some of that is performative. You sit there and you sign all these executive orders, 200 of them in one day, and then you throw the Sharpie into the crowd. Then he's performing the autocrat. But that's for a reason. That's because that's the kind of government he likes. He doesn't like dealing with Congress. He doesn't like dealing with all the messy, difficult, backwards moves. For all of this guy who thinks he's such a great deal maker, that deal making that you have to do in the American system between the different branches of government, he doesn't like that one little bit.
He's performing an autocrat, and we all should just really grab on our Orwells and our Huxleys and see where it leads. The performing of it, once it actually, because one of the greatest achievement of Trump is that he solidified this mixture of reality and reality TV. This mixture of meta universes and real universes. We almost don't know where we are right now. And so performing an autocrat can easily turn into non-performing, but actually being an autocrat. And if we look at those decrees that he has signed, these are very terrifying decrees. I mean, I come from a dictatorial country most of the time, Soviet Union, and And then Russia, and they all begin with saying, well, we're just going to suggest that there's strong hand so people would behave, and ultimately it's a strong hand and people behave because otherwise you're going to be in prison. And that's already, the whole federal government is most of the federal government is threatened, because if they support the diversity policy, they're going to be investigated, and others should be squealing on them if they find out. That's sort of, I know it from my homeland. I'm like, oh, I'm just at home right now. My hope is that because Trump is still more performative, at least for now, than actionable, it may not get there. But, if his advisors are going to be Orban, Putin, Xi Jinping, Erdogan of Turkey, we will get there, because this is going to be an interesting club for them to form.
Just to be clear, Nina, because you know Russia so well, and of course, you grew up in the Soviet Union, and you have family connections to that history. Do you see America, a country that still prides itself on being the greatest democracy in the world, backsliding into dictatorship?
Well, I cannot see it because I cannot imagine it. But precedents have happened, and I actually, even the first time of Trump, when people couldn't believe that he could be president, I have to almost brag. I don't brag. That's not a bragging, but I thought that given this kind of even performative reality TV, Hollywood nature, media nature of the American culture, it's entirely possible, because we keep looking at American presidents often from the TV lens. Remember when John Kennedy became president and they had the first debate, Richard Nixon, which was on the radio, he won the debate. But on TV, when you have the Kennedy smile, this great kind of this Hollywood brilliantly looking man, he was the one who was winner of the debate. Ronald Reagan, he was, by the way, talking about Gunfight a Nation, the B movies, the sort of this cowboy movies. So it is very big part of what America chooses, is how they look.
Nina, I just want to talk specifically about Vladimir Putin. So, I'm not sure. I don't know. I can't figure out what the relationship is between Putin and Trump. And Trump himself has been sending some mixed messages here. On one hand, he says, I get on great with the guy. But mind you, George Bush also once said, I've seen into the soul of Vladimir Putin, and I'm not that worried. But on the other hand, there's Trump just yesterday saying, well, if they don't come up with a deal with Ukraine sometime soon, there'll be taxes, tariffs, and repercussions. So what's Trump actually telling Putin, and what does Putin make of it?
In terms of Putin, Trump is a mixed messaging guy. He's in one sentence, he can say totally contradictory things. And like so one part of the mouth says one thing and then you end with another one. I think, he admires strong hand leaders. It's not just Putin he admires, and it's Erdogan, it's Xi Jinping, and even Kim Jong-un. He said, well, we got along famously and whatnot. These are the guys that he understands. They don't need to meddle. So these are his people. And Putin does have a steely gaze. You really cannot read behind that. And it does make Trump nervous, because Trump wants to think that he's the greatest dog in the universe. And so suddenly Putin is just silent and Trump is giving him and Putin is receiving or not receiving. So they have that. It doesn't really matter what kind of governments elsewhere. It's just, if we are not interfering with each other. So that's important to him. But he also listens to what people say to him, and you cannot really look weak in front of Putin. So when you say you want a deal, you also have to scare him that the deal is not going to happen. And actually, after yesterday's declarations that otherwise, if they don't agree, otherwise we are going to sanction and tariff and whatnot. And so the Russians, I was actually on the phone this morning with colleagues there who have access to the high ups, and they're like, they're scratching their heads. Like, what does he mean? Because we got no offers, so we haven't even rejected anything. So what the hell are we discussing here? And so they understand it's a rhetorical flourishes. We also know that on Monday, when Putin congratulated Trump, remember, which was very rare. It's an unfriendly country, the way it's called in Russia. So they congratulated. They actually moved the Security Council from Wednesday, which was yesterday, to Monday, So there would be a formula that Security Council agreed, the Russian Security Council, that Putin is going to congratulate. So Russia makes certain steps, but Trump he goes with the PR formula that works for him today. So there will be some sort of negotiations, but I think the Russians hope that will work out. But I also know that it's a hope against their experience, because they hope and then it doesn't work. So I think for Putin's stance, it would be great if it works out, but if not, they're going to continue, and it would be more opportunity for him to turn into, if it doesn't work, to turn into World War II, that every Russian, like as was every Soviet in 1941, the war with Nazis, go to the front and fight until death, because Putin is not going to be defeated. Whatever it is, he may not win, but he's not going to be defeated. And so that's the mindset in Russia, with hope that it will work out with Trump nonetheless.
I mean, I want to talk about Ukraine in a minute, Lindsey, but first of all, this idea that you've got, one emerging autocrat in one of the world's superpowers, you've got another autocrat running, a former superpower, you've got another autocrat running, the next superpower, China. All these autocrats, all these strongmen trying to carve up the world. I mean, does that not end in tears at some stage when you look back at history?
It does, and it ends up with Europe being crushed, as we've seen before. Because in amongst, if we look at these blocks, and then what about Europe? And Europe is extremely, with the exception of Hungary, we're very wedded to our democratic ways, and we're very divided. We're not a place which is going to have one big strong man. It's a complex system, European Union and through NATO and so on, and people working together, and things take time, and people don't make gestures in the same way, or they make them at home, but they can't make them for the whole continent and so on, because we've seen enough of that, right? We have World War II, World War I.
We bought the T-shirt, haven't we, Lindsey? Been there, done that.
Exactly, right back to, Prussia and goodness knows what. So that, I think, is one of the things which European countries are looking at with great anxiety.
Nina, I mean, let's talk about Ukraine here, because, again, what I don't really understand at the moment, and maybe you can help me, is where do you think this Ukraine war ends this year, and how does it end? Because I'm sure that, Zelensky wants to end it on some terms because he's running out of men. I'm sure that Putin wants to end it on his terms at some stage. I'm sure that America wants to stop funding something that could go on forever. Is there a kind of landing strip where they can all meet and everyone can talk to their own crowd and say, look, we've achieved something here that many people thought was impossible?
It is and it isn't, I think, because Putin can say we've achieved something, we had certain conditions, we got, in fact, even more than we hoped for, because when, once again, in American media, I think it's a mistake to say, well, and Joe Biden says, well, Putin didn't get what he wanted. He didn't occupy Ukraine. Putin never planned to occupy Ukraine. Putin wanted that sphere of influence. The world doesn't think that Putin or Russia and America are on the same level. Putin thinks it should be, and that's how he acts. So he would say, we got more territory that we hoped for. We exhausted Ukrainian army. We showed the West that Russia cannot be defeated. So we're okay. We're not giving anything else, but we can stop if you are cooperate. I think for Vladimir Zelensky, it's much more complicated, because Vladimir Zelensky already a few days ago, he said, well, we may agree if we are agreeing on 24th of February 22. So if that territory goes back to Ukraine, Putin is not going to agree with that. So Zelensky keeps giving some territory, but not all. Will he be willing to say, okay, I just want to stop the fighting because we have no people? Because then his people will ask him, what was that about for the last 3 years? It's also embarrassing for Europe. So if they agree that they're all going to be allowed to save face one way or another, and I'm not sure that they will, then we can get to some sort of resolution.
The issue everybody has talked about is the old formula of land for peace, that Ukrainians would have to agree that Russia temporarily occupies some of their land, and in return they would get security guarantees. And I think that is where you have the problem with Donald Trump. because security guarantees to stop the Russians coming back for more in 1, 2, 3, or 4 years' time, maybe when Donald Trump is no longer in office. That is a complicated thing, which Putin is going to fight to the last bit. But Trump will probably have lost interest by then, because what he's interested in is a lack of fighting. He's not interested in peace, which is a different thing. So with this, and similarly in Gaza, what he wants to see is people not fighting anymore. So he can say, look, I brought peace. But we all know that that is not how it works. The way you get lasting peace is by treaties, by agreement, by trust being built up. And none of that is the kind of thing that he is interested in or any good at. And so that, I think, is the great difficulty of him declaring victory. Look, I've stopped all that fighting, and everybody else knowing that the moment he turns his back, they're going to go back for more.
What do you think that the Ukrainians would be prepared to settle for? That, what would Zelensky be able to sell them in terms of security guarantees that does not involve full-fledged membership of NATO? Because astonishingly, that still seems to be off the cards.
Yeah. I was in Ukraine in December, and the mood has changed. And there's a weariness and a need for this war to come to an end. And you haven't got the same, you go on to victory in every inch of our territory, because people know that that's not realistic. And they're just, people are just worn down and miserable and desperate. And so I think there would be a willingness to sacrifice territory. It won't be, a sacrifice that says that this becomes part of Russia, but at least for the moment, accepting that Ukraine doesn't control all of its territory. But the security guarantees would have to be robust enough that if, and I think most Ukrainians would say when, Putin comes back again in a year's time or 2 years' time, that somebody else will be there fighting with us. And that's what's very difficult to imagine.
Nina, let me ask you, what do you think Putin would be prepared to accept that was not kind of completely defanged, demilitarized Ukrainian neutrality?
So demilitarization, they already think that Ukraine cannot produce anything. They would probably demand some freedom for the Russian language. They would want their Catherine the Great back in Odessa. They would want their Pushkin back somewhere, or that could be part of the negotiation. I really don't know what would the Russians agree, and it all depends. I think it all depends on Trump's, if Trump is filigree enough in his out of the deal as he promises he is, because Putin can negotiate. If he is recognized as one of the great power person, he may negotiate, because Russians are very vain this way to be recognized by Western powers.
Well, vanity is not confined to Russia at the moment. I think we can be safe to say that. There's plenty of it going on in that building down the road from here. Just on spheres of influence as well. I mean, when this whole thing started in Ukraine, there were these, impossible demands from Russia. There should never be NATO troops in the Baltic states. Sweden and Finland should never be members of NATO. All these things, of course, have been overturned. Do you think that is what he wants, Putin? Does he want to push NATO back further from places where they are legitimately established right now? So this isn't just about Ukraine, it's also about the Baltic republics, or it's about Poland, or Romania, and basically those parts of Eastern Europe that used to be very much in the Soviet sphere of influence.
In 25 years, let me remind you, 25 years of power, absolute power corrupts absolutely. We not exactly know what's in his brain. I mean, does he want the whole world? Does he want just spheres of influence? I see that he doesn't want to fight NATO. And so NATO keeps kind of saying he's going to go to Europe, but I see he doesn't want to. And that's why, for example, the Kursk incursion continues to be the Kursk incursion. Otherwise, it would have been a declaration of war. So that gives me some idea that he's willing to negotiate, but he also is not willing to be humiliated. And so it depends on how you frame it. And that's what we go back to the Trump potential as a great producer of his own show. Trump can do it. Whether his advisors and he himself understand Putin enough to do it, or Russia enough, or the future enough, that's a question.
Okay. Final question to both of you. So, I went to some talk the other day, and there was a former head of the British Army who said we are already in the foothills of World War III. and he looks at the kind of axis of strongmen, North Korea, Iran, China, Russia, and now Trump joins the club in a kind of ambiguous way. And he himself, and I've heard this from other people too, is deeply worried that all this will coalesce into some kind of global conflagration. So with America playing, in this sort of odd position of having a wannabe strongman in the Oval Office, but it's still, a democracy, where do you think the most likely global flashpoint will be in the coming years?
Well, the global flashpoint at the moment is still Europe, isn't it? It's Ukraine, and that hasn't gone away. But then what the PLA, the People's Liberation Army in China, is supposedly, they're expecting to be ready to invade Taiwan or blockade Taiwan or take control of Taiwan by 2027. That doesn't mean that they're going to do it, but that is what they're aiming at being ready for. So that is obviously another flashpoint, and certainly within the Trump administration.
If Trump were to intervene, right? I mean, Trump may say, you know what, you can keep your chips and you can keep your Taiwan, and I'm not going to do anything about it. We don't know.
Yeah, but I think that Trump would probably not intervene. So then that would mean that China had, extended its power, and then it's been trying to extend power all across, South China Sea and through to the Philippines and, Cambodia and Vietnam. Again, the sphere of influence. And we see an increasingly close relationship between Russia and China, and particularly between President Xi Jinping and President Putin, who have met more than 50 times. And I think there were a lot of analysts who a few years ago thought that this was just like a marriage of convenience. But actually, the more I read, the more it's just that actually the two of them have a very similar worldview, that they get along very well. And they see themselves together facing this American enemy. So in that case, the flashpoint can be anywhere. And I think that the danger with Trump, he doesn't want to enter any kind of war, which is a good thing. But the fact is that he doesn't seem to understand the complicated diplomatic maneuvers that you need to do to prevent war. And that, I think, is one of the major dangers of the next 4 years.
I agree. I think it can happen from everywhere because we are so close to, it's like World War I. Anything, any gunshot somewhere that we don't even think about can turn into something very dangerous. And because America is no longer a leader in this and sort of trying to provide some sort of checks and balances, that it's free for all. It's almost like Trump is declaring free for all, and in free for all, things can happen at any moment. Look at Serbia. What if something once again happens there? Because we already hear from the Serbian president that they've been trying to overrule power, and we're not going to allow that, and so on and so forth. So Europe, Asia, Africa. That conflict can also kind of blow up. And let's not forget Israel and Palestine.
Thank you very much to both of you. Lindsey Hilsum, Nina Khrushcheva, it's an absolute pleasure. Thank you for your insights. That's it from the Fourcast from Washington once again. Thanks for watching.